So we're going to proceed with a conversation about what the Old Testament is. And this is a tricky question, right? Because there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. And if we talk about what we've been just talking about in terms of exegesis, stepping back from the text might require us to answer this question in various ways. The first thing I think we can observe about the Old Testament is it's not just one book. It's not a continuous narrative. It's not like a long novel that you would just start reading and read from the beginning to the end. In fact, the Old Testament is made up of an anthology of various books and chapters, okay? And various, not just the different books and chapters, but also the varying genres that are part of that, right? So you've got, all kinds of different genres represented. You've got law, you've got narrative, you've got Psalms, you've got Proverbs, you've got prophets, you've got all kinds of different writings, wisdom writings like Job, all kinds of stuff in there. And each one has a different way of talking about God. And as I mentioned in my last lecture, you've got different writers, different voices over a different periods of time who have different perspectives on who God is. So it's a collection. It's not just a collection, it's a selection. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that the Hebrew Bible is a selection of texts that a community chose to read. And the process by which they made those decisions was called canonization. They chose, over a period of several hundred years, to read these texts and not other texts. So I think that's important to keep in mind. The canon comes from the Greek word, which means rule or measuring stick. So usually when we talk about a canon, we're talking about a closed list of writings that a community considers sacred scripture and hence authoritative. But that leads us to the second understanding of what the Old Testament means. Are we reading the same book? We have actually 3 different canons when we turn to the Old Testament. We have the Hebrew Scripture, which is the Jewish canon. And then we have the Christian canon, which is made up of really 3 or maybe even 4 different collections. The Protestants have a different collection of Old Testament documents that they regard as Scripture than the Roman Catholic and the Eastern churches do. And that's because of what the Protestants call the Apocrypha, a bunch of books that are collected in the Old Testament that are read by the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches that are not read as Scripture by the Protestant churches. So we have different books that make up this canon. And then there's a very different order in our canon as in the Jewish canon. I think that's particularly important to keep in mind as well. But it's also perspective. Remember, as we talked about exegesis in the last chapter, we talked about the world in front of the text and the world behind the text and the world of the text. Well, our contemporary realities may actually, even if we're reading the same words, a Jewish reader may hear and see things differently than a Christian reader, and so on and so forth. So the same text, the same words may be different for different communities. Now, let's talk about the Jewish canon, because that's the canon that I'm actually following, the Hebrew order of the Hebrew books in this class. The Jewish canon is typically called the Tanakh. The Tanakh. And it is a collection of 3 different sections of the Bible: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Now, the Torah is the book of the law, the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the law. The Nevi'im, the prophets, include the writing prophets that we're familiar with, like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah and Amos and all those guys. Yeah, those guys are included in the prophets, but the Jewish canon, interestingly enough, the Hebrew Bible includes prophets prophetic writings, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. What Protestants believe are the historical writings. We think about those as the prophets. And then the third major division of the Jewish canon are the writings, the Ketuvim, the Psalms, the Proverbs, anything that doesn't fit in those first two categories. Okay, and that was an open category well into the 2nd century after Christ. So the Jewish canon was not closed, really, even during the Christian era. And that's probably why we've got so much confusion and literally three different collections that we all call Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, whatever you want to call it. So that's part of the reason is the Jewish canon was still not closed as Christ was living. Now, the Torah, which we'll be spending a lot of time with, are these 5 books, the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And it's made up of narrative, right, which is the story of the beginning, the creation of the world, this family of Abraham, all the way through Moses, Joseph, and then ending down in Egypt, and then Moses bringing the people out of Egypt. And it's that story of that Abraham family from Genesis 12 all the way into Deuteronomy. But interspersed in this great narrative are large portions of legal material. So Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, a whole bunch of laws in there. For most Jews, the Torah is the primary scripture. It is their foundational narrative, and it's their foundational law. The Nevi'im, like I said, are the prophets. I talked about Joshua through 2nd Kings. Again, that's a narrative text. It's the story of Israel's life in Canaan and the development of the kingdoms, first the kingdom of Israel and Judah, and then how the two split, and then finally are conquered by outside conquerors, Assyria, and then finally falling to Babylon. So the former prophets is the first part of the prophets, which most Protestants would call history. The latter prophets are like the writing prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Book of the 12. Those are the guys who sort of stand up and they shout their little prophecies, and we'll be talking about the function of prophecy a lot as we get into those texts. And the Ketuvim is very interesting, the writings. There's a variety of books. In the Jewish text, the historical narrative that is repeated, that is from the former prophets, First and 2nd Chronicles, repeats a lot of this material that is in 1st and 2nd Kings. So some of that is historical, and then we have Daniel and Ruth and Esther, which we can talk about as sort of stories that go along with that period of time. Then you have poetry like the Psalms and Song of Songs, Lamentations and Proverbs. Then you have writings like Job and Ecclesiastes belong to that. It's a whole hodgepodge of stuff in the writings. Now, like I said, the Torah began to be compiled as early as the 5th century before Christ. We think that the Torah and the prophets were both canonized and probably set by the 2nd century before Christ. But the writings themselves were not fully canonized until the 2nd century CE. Now, what's interesting is even in Jesus' time, he'll talk about the law, the prophets, and if you look in the Gospels, Jesus talks about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. So we know that most of the Psalms were probably included in the writings by Jesus' time. I think the question mark is which other works were included in those writings during Jesus' time, and what the early church used. They used a lot of texts that were Jewish but didn't quite make it into the final Jewish canon. What are the criteria for canonization? the text had to be believed to have been written before the 4th century BCE, but we know that Daniel, probably is much later than that, maybe into 150 portions of it. The language is primarily Hebrew, although portions of Daniel are Aramaic. And then they had to be used by the Jewish community. Now, the Christian canon is really interesting because the early church, after Jesus, typically followed what we call as the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And the Greek translation was written between 3rd and 1st century before Christ. In that translation, what it did was it solidified the canon of the Old Testament for those Jews who were outside of Israel.